Hollow. Sleepy Hollow. Hello, everyone. Oh, here, let me fix that. Hello, everyone. If you're new to my live stream, it doesn't get better than this. I sit here and I work on these guys, and you watch and you listen, or you check in every once in a while to see if I've super glued my fingers together. You know, whatever worked for you. But it is very basic. Let's see. I'll bring this up right quick. I know I should have done it before, but I didn't, so get over it. What a mess, what a mess, what a mess. Either way. Here we are. No, this doesn't give me any help. There we go. All right. Shoot. Sleepy Hollow. Let's finish that up. I think this is the one I was listening to. Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.
Some uncouth clouds floated in the sky without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of a fine golden tint, changing gradually into a...
I've lost my place in the story, unfortunately.
Pure apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the mid-heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crest.
Saw them run a man down the field. On horseback, they ran him down. He was on foot.
Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of metal and mischief.
Not too far off from where we were.
Himself could manage.
There we go.
He was, in fact, noted preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks which kept Ryder in constant risk of his neck, for he held a tractable, well-broken horse as unworthy of a lad of spirit. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Not those of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in the sumptuous time of autumn. Such heaped up platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut, the tender olykoek, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies.
Hello.
Besides slices of ham.
Welcome
and
to the live stream. Thank you guys for giving me a thumbs up before you head out for the night.
Dishes
I'm
of
make some dead fairies.
plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I've enumerated them, with the motherly teapot.
We're listening to Hair.
Clouds
Sleepy
of
Hollow
vapor from the midst. Heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, and am too eager to get on with my story. Happily, Ichabod Crane was not in so great a hurry as his historian, but did ample justice to every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature, whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes round him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this scene of almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then he thought,
oh, thank you for the thumbs up.
Very
much appreciated.
On the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hansbon Ripper and every other niggardly patron, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out of the doors that should dare to call him comrade.
I'll be in trouble.
Archie. Everyone, I would like to propose a toast to the wonderful bounty you see before you, and that the Lord blessed us all with its abundance. Yes, Mr. Ichabod. Amen. Now, everyone, as my grandfather used to say, Nog vele Yaren, many happy returns. Enjoy yourself.
Old Balthus Van Tassel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief but expressive.
Hi, everyone. Thanks
being
for stopping in.
confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now, the sound of the music from the common room or hall summoned the dance. The musician was an old gray-headed Negro who had been the itinerant orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a movement of his head, bowing almost to the ground and stamping with his foot whenever a fresh couple was to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle. And to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. He was the admiration of all the Negroes who, having gathered, of all ages and sizes, from the farm in the neighborhood, stood forming a pyramid of shining black faces at every door and window, gazing with delight at the scene, rolling their white eyes and showing grin of ivory from ear to ear.
That's stuff long ago.
How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings. While Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks, who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war.
When I was Hessian mercenaries, saw them run a man down in the field. On horseback, they ran him down. He was on foot. And Hessian just rode right by him and swung his sword, chopped that man's head right off. Yeah, so. Right now, you, schoolmaster, you ever heard of a Haitian? They ride right up on you and cut the head right off your shoulders with their sabers. They ride on horseback and chase you down like a dog. Just like the headless horseman.
I didn't even check to see these freaking wings would be too big.
This neighborhood, at the time of which I am speaking, was one of those highly flavored places which abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had therefore been the scene of marauding and infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little becoming fiction, and in the indistinctness of his recollection, to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Dothieu Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken a British frigate with the old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork.
That's right, take that one back to King George with ya. All right, no one panic. No one panic. I'm on fire. Put me out.
Only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. And there was an old gentleman who shall be nameless, being too rich a minor to be lightly mentioned, who in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, carried a musket ball with a small sword insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz round the blade and glance off at the hilt, in proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword. With the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but was persuaded that he had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But all of these were nothing compared to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind.
Pretty
Local
smaller ones,
tales
but I
and
was just so
superstitions
excited
thrive best in
to get
these
these.
sheltered, long-settled retreats that are trampled underfoot by the shifting throng that forms the population of most of our country places. Besides, there's no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends have traveled away from the neighborhood, so that when they do turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintances left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts, except in our long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that blew from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends.
I'd like some
Many
real butterfly
dismal
wings,
tales were
but
told
I
about
don't know if I can get
funeral
them ethically.
trains, and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken, and which stood in the neighborhood. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of the stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman,
I'll cover that up.
who had been heard several times of late, patrolling the country, and it was said, tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its decent, whitewashed walls shine modestly forth, like Christian purity, beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees, between which peeps may be caught at the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there, at least, the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide, woody dell, along which raves a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it, and the bridge itself, were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow and was obliged to get up behind him, and how they galloped over bush and brake, over hill and swamp until they reached the bridge, when the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones.
Oh, Brower, you're so full of beans. With all due respect.
Who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey.
You think that's something? On my way home.
He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper.
Hey there, Headless. Want a race?
That he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep into the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author Cotton Mather,
Okay, everybody hang on for a minute.
and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families in their wagons and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite swains, and their light-hearted laughter, mingling with the clatter of hoofs, echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview, I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth after no very great interval with an air quite desolate and chapfallen. Oh, these women, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart, without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he had so often gloated. He went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountain corn and oats and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards along the sides of lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him, the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop riding quietly at anchor
No,
over the
look in here.
land.
There we go.
In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson. But it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of the distance from this faithful companion of man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock accidentally wakened would sound far, far off from some farmhouse away among the hills. But it was like a dreaming sound in his ear.
27 of you wandered in here.
No signs
Hi
of
guys,
life
welcome to me
occurred
making weird stuff.
near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in its bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood, and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large
35
enough
you
to
wandered
form
in here.
trunks for
You must
ordinary
be lost.
trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner hard by
My last
and
one?
was universally known by the name of Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition,
One left.
partly out of
Nice.
sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning and the white wood laid bare.
Ichabod, pray, stop being silly this instant.
Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon the other, as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road, where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This had ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution,
All right.
gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder.
All right, you. I have had quite enough. You go forward now.
Who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head.
You beast. I swear I will. My.
Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late. And besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents,
Who are you?
He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice.
Sir, I demand to know, who are you?
Still,
There we go.
there was no answer.
Alright. Now,
Once more,
the
he
details.
cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune.
I wish these were better looking, but they are all I have.
Just then, the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman, large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder. who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle.
No!
His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through the thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long,
You're gonna go in this
body
next.
away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road, which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon instead of keeping up it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge, famous in Goblin story, and just beyond swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck, when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans von Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and, unskillful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on another, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of the horse's backbone with violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him, with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared.
If I can but reach the bridge, I am safe.
Just then, he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then, he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse.
I wonder where Mr. Ichabod is. Yeah, I know.
And strolled idly about the banks of the brook.
My daddy told me that he heard the headless horseman got him. No way, Kevin. Yes, he did so. You guys shut up. It's so full of beans, Kevin.
Kevin.
But no schoolmaster. Hans van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod.
I tell you what, that Ichabod friend.
And his saddle.
You better hope the headless horseman got it.
An inquiry was set on foot.
Okay, that'll do. Not my favorite flowers, but that'll do.
And after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces.
Hey, I think I found something over here.
In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle, trampled in the dirt.
Don't look good.
The tracks of horses' hoofs, deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black,
It looks like his hat.
was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it,
The rest of the pumpkin.
a shattered pumpkin.
Well, we've done everything we can. We tried to find the schoolmaster. Let's go home.
The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle which contained all his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 stocks for the neck, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a dusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor of the heiress of Van Tassel. These magic books and the poetic scrawl were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans van Ripper, who, from that time forward, determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good come of the same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had it about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brower, of Bones, and a whole budget of others were called to mind. And when they had diligently considered them all and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in his stead. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans von Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country.
So you see, my dear gentleman, if the glove doesn't fit, you must quit.
Had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar.
You may now kiss the bride.
Shit.
All right.
Your fat fingers are too fat to hold this. Come here, you.
Was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood round the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay, and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue, and the ploughboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow.
That's not bad. All right. I suppose we're gonna find something, don't we? Something else to listen to.
Shake and win millions of prizes with the AliExpress $1 challenge. Get unreal deals for just $1. Win $10,000 in flight credits and a $3,000 AliExpress shopping spree. Download, shake, win.
Done.
Straightener sizzle? Use OGX heat protectant spray for non-stop damage protection. OGX.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
What are you on now? Let me see how it sounds.
The Mourner. Written by Gareth Shaw. Performed by Alicia Pavlis. Featuring David Lewis Richardson and Peter Bishop.
I like these with the grass.
Audio production and music by Jeff Clement. With their black clothing and hats jeweled by the combined moistures of drizzle and fog, the huddled mourners looked beautiful through the zoom lens. Katie panned the camera across the throng to better admire the perfection of the scene. Long overcoats, sleek shirts, heels stabbing into the grass, banded Homburgs, even a scattering of spiderwebbed veils, all spoke of the wealth and power gathered round the open grave, like Hollywood's idea of the perfect somber funeral. The fog swirled, gravestones leaned in the foreground, and the limp branches of a willow provided a sway of green backdrop so that the mourners were like black opals lying against a jeweler's felt. The camera clicked and froze the image forever. Excellent. A fine picture, all would agree, but not good enough for Katie right then. Not when she could sense perfection hovering within reach. She waited for the final detail to slot into place and create the shot, the one guaranteed to accompany that month's feature article. All that stood, literally, between Katie and her big breakthrough was a thin man in what looked to be an ill-fitting suit, his sloping shoulders narrow, but just wide enough to obscure the star of the show and many others. The recently widowed Felicity Royal, her wide hat haloed the man's head in black, but her face was hidden.
It's one little brush that does it all with root touch-up, Calero. It's so me.
Oh, that was a stupid thing to do. I like the stuck of it now.
Come on, move, she urged him through gritted teeth, shifting as the damp grass started to soak through her jeans. Like a suddenly flourished handkerchief, the priest stepped out of the throng and stood looking into the grave to the left of the shot, his bright white robes contrasting perfectly with the gloominess of the falling light. He started to speak.
I like this fern.
Katie could hear the drone, but not make out the words from her prone position behind a manicured hedge, and the mourners' heads bowed as one. Shit, this is it, move your ass, she hissed at the thin man. A woman's head dropped onto the shoulder of her companion. Come on, for God's sake. The priest's hands clasped a blood-red dab to his chest. All she could think was, not quite the one, not quite the one, not quite the one. Never before had she wished anyone dead, truly and sincerely and horribly dead, but she wished a whole range of grisly fates on that thin man right then. Each passing second, each click of the camera meant the chance, this glorious, possibly once-in-a-career chance was slipping away, all thanks to some skinny bastard in an overpriced suit. Katie hissed through her nostrils as the priest's words ended. Several of the throng shifted slightly, about to lift their heads. She screamed silently behind the shrubbery, wrestling with her fury to keep the camera still. Then it happened. The skinny man stepped to his right, just one step, to pat someone on the elbow, and suddenly, the widow herself, Felicity Royal, a mascara-streaked crimson lipstick version of the Felicity Royal who had graced televisions the country over for years, glanced up at the overcast heavens, her ashen face emerging like a beacon from under her hat, whilst those around her still gloomed at the sodden ground. The chief editor beamed and thumped his desk.
Now that
He boomed, jabbing a finger at the laptop screen in front of him.
is 15 karat solid gold.
Katie smiled the modest smile she had practiced in the mirror a couple of hours ago when the summons to the office of Peep had come through. The fact that the magazine had been in touch mere minutes after she emailed the photo confirmed the feeling that had tingled through her since she had captioned the perfect shot of the cemetery. This was it. Peep's chief editor spun the laptop round to her, and Katie's modesty crumbled in the glow of her photograph on the screen. A shadowy, somber masterpiece etched out in pin-sharp, high resolution.
Oh, not right now, Catherine.
The editor almost shouted and Katie flinched, the grin dying on her face.
Come on, you bloody paid those people to pose, didn't you? Couldn't be better if you'd told them where to stand.
She breathed in relief and adjusted her skirt over her knees. Just in the right place at the right time, I suppose. The editor sat back, pulling the laptop back towards him, eyes on the screen, and laughed.
You make that sound like luck. That's the trick of your job, isn't it?
Katie watched his eyes flicker around the image, seeing how they constantly came back to the pale, upward-turned face of Felicity Royal, and knew with a flush of heat that thousands would soon do the same thing when they saw the front cover of Peep on the shelves in a month's time.
Bloody hell, the composition is perfect.
The editor continued in a more hushed voice, as if seeing the photograph for the first time.
The mourners, trees, the gravestones.
He paused for a breath.
And her. Beautiful and sad and lost, all at the same time. The punters are gonna lap it up.
Looking at the back of the laptop's lid, Katie remembered the widow in that one moment and the raw, naked pain on Felicity Royal's face that had never been seen on a television screen. A pain that the public was soon to hungrily drink in. For the first time, she felt the faintest needle prick of guilt. But then the editor lowered the screen, and the talk turned to money and royalties and an extended contract. The meeting ended quickly, with promises of being in touch soon and a brisk handshake.
Oh, Catherine.
The editor stopped her before she closed the door.
Unfortunately, there's no such thing as perfection, you know.
She frowned in puzzlement.
We'll have to airbrush the weirdo out. He spoils the mood a bit. No big deal. Speak to you on Tuesday.
Katie, still frowning, clicked the door shut with hot hands and hurried to the lift, already reaching for the tablet in her bag. Weirdo. She shakily opened the photo file and peered at the image she thought she knew so well. What had the editor said? He spoils the mood a bit. He. Katie scanned the mourners, seeing them all anew. They were actually people now, not glamorous funeral mannequins. Their faces contorted or slackened or rigid with genuine grief. She picked out the men, all holding onto female hands or arms or shoulders. All except one. A thin man, the one who had moved just in time, stood turned to the side, and he stood alone. His face was lined and angular in profile. His eye hidden in the shadow of a deep socket made him appear to be in his 50s at least, in a black suit that, now Katie looked more closely, wasn't particularly expensive. His gaunt face bowed to the open grave and hands clasped. He looked every inch the mourner, apart from the fact that he was grinning.
Ooh. Interesting.
Meet the Harders. The 7% Mike's Harder Lemonade family with the Short King, Lil Mike's, the Mike's Mega Can, and the Mix Pack. Flavors that go harder. That's the Mike's Harder Lemonade family.
The wrought iron cemetery gates loomed grandly against a big sky of cloudless blue, inviting Katie inside onto a path that wound amongst the grass and gravestones. The sun made her squint, but curling leaves pooling in the lengthening shadows of tree trunks signaled the final days of summer, and she zipped up her jacket. In the distance, across the spiky, stony sweep of headstones, a high fence of iron spears and broad trees marked the section of the cemetery that was closed off to the ordinary members of the public. Further along the fence, there was a slight gap where she had squeezed through a few days ago. The private section was where Felicity Royal's husband was buried, where she had taken what promised to be a career-defining photograph. where a thin man had stood amongst a grieving crowd and smiled. The hollow indented eye socket, the laughter lines spiderwebbing from one corner of his eye, the long crease from cheek to clean-shaven chin, the pale, pale lips pursed in amusement, all magnified on Katie's laptop screen, had haunted her ever since. She couldn't get over the wrongness of his expression. Again and again she had peered at the faces of all the mourners, trying to spot one of them sharing the thin man's smile. She unconsciously capitalized him now, trying to see anything that might have sparked his humor. Their expressions varied slightly, but all were contorted in sadness. Perhaps the man was remembering some joke he'd shared with the deceased, or a happy memory. Somehow that didn't explain it. At first, the sneaky nature of the smile had convinced her the thin man was pleased that Mr. Royal was dead, and she began to contrive all sorts of plots and crimes that he might be guilty of. He was a jealous brother, a scheming business partner, a murderous family physician. She soon dismissed such soap opera thinking, but could not shift the conviction that he was guilty of something other than a severe lack of empathy or tact. A breath of wind edged with autumn ruffled Katie's hair, and she looked up to see that she had reached the end of the public section of the cemetery. The gate at the path's end was only slightly smaller than the main entrance, but padlocked, with opening times posted in a glass case and directions pointing to a porter's lodge. Here, the public gravestones were older, their edges rounded with names faded or mossed over. The air was damp and darker here, the sun screened by a thick green canopy of trees overhanging the private fence. But it was quiet and restful. Spurts of unkempt grass wavered in another gust as if waving goodbye to warmer seasons. The graves and verges nearer the main entrance were cleaner and trimmed and ordered, but Katie liked the sense of freedom and privacy here. She supposed that this distant corner would be pretty spooky at night, but in the September sunshine it was
beautiful,
someone said. Katie yelped and spun around.
Isn't it?
The thin man asked, standing nearby, staring at her. Yes, Katie answered reflexively, taking a small step back, hand fluttering to her chest before she could stop it. Pale lips pursing, the thin man smiled. A smile that she knew so well, and the sight of it so close to her made her feel dizzy and unreal. He turned away and bent over to peer at a crumbling gravestone.
There's a bench there.
It took Katie a moment to focus on what he had just said.
Take a seat,
he said, rubbing some moss away from an inscription. His voice was soft and oddly comforting, like a granddad's voice. She looked around, saw the bench behind her and sat down, frowning at the tremble in her thighs. Get a grip of yourself, girl. Bloody hell. Look at the age of him. You would knock him over with one hand. Up close, Katie saw that he was a lot older than she had first thought. Perhaps in his 80s, judging by the veins showing through the papery skin on his knuckly hands. It didn't so much as quiver as he claimed the headstone, however, and he moved with slow certainty, not even bending his knees to reach down. White hair swept back, covered his head, and rested like strands of cotton on his collar. The thin man's suit had once been expensive, she could tell by the cut, but had the stiff shininess of unwashed black worn too often. His trousers ended just above grey socks, adding to the slight air of shabbiness that hung about him.
I can do for that one.
In her photograph, he had looked a lot more smart, a lot sharper. The suit wasn't right on him, she decided. It hung awkwardly about him, creasing and folding in the wrong places. He'd probably had it for years and had shrunk as old men do, age withering them into shadowy versions of their former selves. He was certainly thin. The padded suit shoulders drooped significantly, but he didn't seem fragile in the slightest.
That's better,
he said, flicking away the last bit of moss and standing upright. Katie squinted. He sort of rolled smoothly upright rather than jerkily straightening, as she expected. He saw her watching and placed a hand on his lower back while stretching extravagantly. His smile crooked into a grimace.
I should take it easy. These old bones grumble at me more and more each day.
Bloody charlatan. You're more limber than me, Katie thought, but smiled sympathetically. The thin man gestured to the bench, smiling again.
Mind if I take the weight off these achy legs?
Trying not to hesitate, Katie slid over and placed her handbag between them. She crossed her legs and pretended not to look as he sighed loudly down onto his seat. Again, despite the outward show of fragility, he seemed to flow into position. The bench didn't even creak as he settled his weight into place and neatly folded his hands in his lap. He too gazed out at the gravestone stretching out before them.
As I was saying, it's beautiful, isn't it?
All in that mellow granddad voice of his. It didn't seem reassuring now, though, right by her like someone speaking in an advert or narrating in a film. The thin man didn't speak loudly, but his words rumbled in her teeth and bones, like the bass was turned up too loudly. Also, old and thin as he was, he seemed to fill the space next to Katie, and she had to fight the urge to shift away from him. She nodded neutrally, wondering what about this old man was raising the hairs on her arms.
I love this place at this time of year.
He paused and inhaled deeply through his nostrils.
A meeting of borders and the edges of things.
An arm swept out dramatically.
Here we are in a place where the living visit the dead. At a time when things stop growing and get ready to die away.
Leaning forward so that he intruded into Katie's field of vision, he continued.
That grave there, for example.
She turned her head to see him pointing at the headstone he had been cleaning earlier.
Edna Bradbury found out she had cancer when she was 34, knew it was terminal, and made the most of her remaining time. Last 6 months of her life were the best, they said. To paraphrase the old line, the flame that burns half as long burns twice as bright. As I say, borders and edges. I remember her funeral well. Good turnout. Big blue sky, like today. She was well loved.
Katie's unease was growing and her scalp started to prickle with sweat. She blurted out, "So, do you come here often then?" And winced. "Nice one, Katie girl. Now you're using one of the oldest chat-up lines in the book on an old man. Go get your walking stick, hotshot, you've pulled." The thin man didn't laugh or smile as she expected.
Oh yes.
He let the hiss drift out into silence.
But then, you know I do. You've seen me here before, haven't you?
Caught off guard, she flushed and started to sputter something, anything. He had held up a long-fingered hand to stop her and laughed heartily. Like a television Santa, she thought wildly. Ho, 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 merry funeral.
Don't worry yourself, Katie. I'm not angry.
She sat bolt upright at the mention of her name. What is this?
Turns out we're a lot alike. Let me explain.
How does he know my name? As the thin man reached into a pocket inside his blazer, Katie, thoughts and questions whirling, looked around the cemetery and realized this section was empty. It seemed no one, well, nobody except the weirdo all-stars on this bench, came to this forgotten corner. Feeling confused and foolish and somehow cornered, her eyes traced along the path to the distant far entrance gates. Why don't I just get up and walk away? She wondered, and felt her thigh muscles tensing to rise.
What's with her thigh muscles?
The
It must be
magazine
written by a
the thin
man.
man placed across her legs stopped her as surely as if he had just dropped a granite gravestone onto them. On the front, corpse-like and blaring close-up, the anguished face of Felicity Royal tilted upwards as if appealing to the word peep, burned blockily across the top in lurid tabloid red. Felicity's slender neck drew the reader's eyes down to the bold white capitals of the headline, Royal Agony. The thin man leaned in close, his scentless breath tickling Katie's cheek.
Now that is simply going to leap off the shelves, don't you think?
He sat back, and Katie could feel his eyes on her.
Good work, Katie.
She felt relief when sudden anger extinguished her fear. She turned on him. What the fuck is this? Are you some kind of sick stalker or something? The thin man merely smiled at her. Do you work for the Royals? Some kind of private detective? She waved the magazine in his face and almost shouted. This is next month's edition. It's not even out yet. How did you get this? Maddeningly, the thin man merely straightened his tie and replied calmly.
Let's just call it a special edition. Advance copy. I don't see why you're so upset. It's a splendid piece of work. Why don't you calm down and turn to page 3?
What? You listen to me, you...
It's a beautiful photograph.
He interrupted smoothly.
But then you already know that, of course. Go on, enjoy the fruits of your labors.
You work at Peep, don't you? Or you know someone there? Someone who got you a copy? Katie tried to hold on to her anger and the strength it had given her. Felt it slipping away, and she didn't resist when the thin man slipped the magazine from her hands. When she looked up, he was holding open a double-page spread. The headline ran, "The Pain and Grief of a Star," above her photograph. Undeniably beautiful, but now awful in that beauty. A very public window into a private moment. Katie imagined people uttering mock sympathy as they bought it along with their cigarettes and chocolate. Women chatting about the tragedy as they waited for their hair to dry in salons. Social media sites discussing what the widow was wearing and whether her jewelry, her dress and shoes. Then someone else would die or become pregnant or get married or divorced or just fall out of a taxi drunk. And Felicity Royal's endless pain would be binned and forgotten. Katie felt sick and claustrophobic and leaned back, trying to see the sky through the maze of branches arching over the bench. Patches and flickers of blue only increased the sense of suffocation, the trees hemming her in with her shame. The thin man stood smoothly, unrolling from the bench, tugging his suit into shape over his frame. He folded Peep and tucked it into his jacket pocket.
I have been to so many funerals in here. And over there, of course.
He gestured to the gate leading to the private section.
But the memories always fade.
He gestured at the grave he had been standing over earlier.
Like in script.
He tried to think of something to say, to ask how he knew about her, but couldn't. The thin man sniffled the air.
Yes. Summer fades and autumn waits for its turn. And here we both are. Orders. See?
He began to stroll away. Wait! It's not right! Katie shouted as her thoughts suddenly struck her. She jumped up from the bench as the thin man stopped. The photograph! It's the wrong one. I mean, you're in it. Keith, the editor. He said you'd be airbrushed out.
Yes, and I will be. I don't crave attention. I like to go about my business quietly.
You got hold of a copy weeks before publication, with a non-edited picture. What the hell is your business? And that wasn't a rough edition you showed me. That looks like a finished product. The thin man half turned to show her the profile and grin she knew so well.
Like I said, special edition.
Katie merely stared as he glided away, his suit dark and lopsided against the white gravel of the path, sauntering like a man half his age. Still, she watched as he went through the gates, turned left, and disappeared. What the hell? She breathed and slumped back onto the bench. Her brain whirled as she tried to rationalize it all. So who was the thin man then? Convinced he had some connection to Peep, she rose, intending to drive down to the office right then and demand some answers. But the gravestone the thin man had taken such an interest in earlier caught her eye. Edna something. Cancer victim. He said he attended the funeral on a day like today. She hesitated. Go on then, you morbid cow. Go have a look, then get the hell out of this place. Perhaps she was a relation of his, she reasoned, and there'll be some clue to who he is. Just what kind of clue she didn't know, however. and supposed she was just trying to justify her grim nosiness. As she expected, despite the thin man's efforts, the inscription was mostly illegible, the lettering eroded. She looked around and saw that most of the graves were unkempt and unloved here in this older part of the cemetery. She frowned, suspicion darkening her thoughts. Peering close, she made out what must have been part of a name. Adbury. That's right, Edna Bradbury. Weather and moss had claimed most of the other writing, but when she licked her thumb and rubbed at indentations near the bottom, Katie revealed a date chiseled neatly into the granite. September 1st, 1897. Nice blue sky there was there, Mr. Thin Man. Bullshit. She stood up with satisfaction. I knew you were full of it, bloody old creep. Katie set off down the path with renewed purpose and was actually smiling
Reaper,
as she
then.
emerged from the tree shade into bright, clear sunshine. Of course, I bet he saw my name as photographer in the magazine. As to how he had known she would be at the cemetery, she still didn't know, but supposed vaguely that he would expect her to revisit the scene of the crime, as her mind put it without thinking, and returning guilt watered down her satisfaction. How he knew she'd be here today, well, it could have been sheer luck, or to hell with that for now. Just get to the office. She nodded, convinced, and clanged the iron gate shut behind her. That bloody editor or someone has got some talking to do.
Center stage, time to shine. Roots of fruits by design. With Claro root touch-up.
Ooh,
Just
I broke it.
brush dry.
Too ambitious, I guess.
It's a seamless blend.
Nobody look at it. No, I dropped I thought it'd be fine.
It's so me.
Did you fund to over $700 billion in just over 25 years, turning it into one of the best performing pension funds in the world.
Yeah,
Just
that's
one more
the
reason we can all be proud to be Canadian.
Damn it.
Despite the pinch of chill in the air, or to see, Katie wound the window down to let some welcome breeze into the car. She hadn't decided what to do once she knew who the thin man was, but for now knowing would be enough. She took a left off the main road onto a residential street to avoid the lights at the crossroad junction, and immediately regretted the decision when the car she had been following suddenly stopped. "Idiot! I nearly went into the back of you!" she shouted out of the window, then immediately pulled her head back in when she saw what the reason was. She barked out a hard laugh. Unbelievable. A funeral procession of a hearse and dozens of mourners slowly made their way up the street. What is it about funerals at the moment? She thought, but didn't speak out loud. For a deep, delicate quiet enveloped the scene, with only the thrumming of the hearse's engine and the occasional scrape of a shoe breaking what would have been utter silence. The lights of the car in front went out, and Katie turned her own engine off as a mark of respect. Local residents peered out of bedroom windows or came to their gates to watch, and Katie remembered herself before an automatic frown of disapproval formed on her face. Your days of being a hypocrite have long gone, I'm afraid. Better get used to a lifetime of not judging. The hearse, long and gleaming, glided past, the driver's face impassive beneath his peaked hat. Katie closed her window as the coffin, polished and new behind flawless glass, drew level with her car. White carnations spelled out, "Grandma." Then the mourners drifted by, obviously a family, with adults and children huddled together, heads bowed. Many others followed a few steps behind, couples linking arms, men with awkward hands clasped behind their backs. The sense of loss ached in the air as the procession snaked towards the cemetery.
There we go.
Katie, not wanting to look, but not knowing what else to do, thought about what the thin man had said about funerals being where death and life meet for a while. She glanced up at the cold, clear sky, especially at a time like this, at the edge of another season. The last of the mourners drifted by, but none looked her way. Car engines starting up broke the spell, and Katie sat up straight, took in a big breath, and turned the key in the ignition. The car in front pulled away, and she turned the wheel to follow, glancing in the rearview mirror as she set off. What? The lopsided suit, creased in the wrong places, the white hair combed back. Him! She almost stalled, the car juddering, recovered and looked again. At the back of the procession, appearing for all of the world like he belonged there, the thin man sauntered after the hearse. He didn't look her way. Bastard! She almost screamed, overcome with a fury she couldn't fully explain. His words came back to her.
I have been to so many funerals.
But how did he get here that fast? He did leave before. Must have known about the funeral, driven here, then slipped into the procession. She remembered a small girl in a dark grey dress, a grandchild probably, sucking her thumb, bewildered, carried by a weeping woman. She banged the steering wheel. Sick bastard! You and me, we are nothing alike, you parasite. All Katie could think about was getting to Peep's office and finding out just who the thin man was once and for all. She sped away and quickly caught the car in front. How about I photograph you again, thin man? Expose you in your own centre-page spread. Wipe that bloody smile off your face. Teeth gritted, she eased off the accelerator, cursing the slowness of the traffic. In the near distance, a traffic light showed amber, and she urged the car in front to get through before it changed to red. She realized that in her anger, she had blindly turned back onto the main road, and was at the crossroads junction she had wanted to avoid in the first place. Damn it! This is the day from hell. Just let me get to that office. With maddening inevitability, the traffic light flipped to red just after the car in front squeezed through. Katie slowed, then cursed loudly and planted her foot on the accelerator. She just had enough time to register the protesting growl of her engine and the blaring of a horn before a bus loomed like a titan and smashed into her. The world boomed, jerked madly, then whirled as Katie's car crumpled in the bus's jaws, scraped sideways, then flipped onto its roof. In seconds, the scream of the bus's brakes and the squealing grind of metal on tarmac tightened into a single thin, high note of pain.
Called it.
Katie moaned as the upside-down world grayed around her before the sharp, coppery stink of blood snapped her back. The seatbelt felt like a band of fire across her chest, and she panicked when she could only manage to inhale a faint whistle of breath. Dimly, she realized the pain needling through her body stopped at her waist. She bent her head up, trying to look at her legs, but they were lost in a tangle of metal, and her neck exploded in agony. Her arms, sleeved in blood, dangled down against the roof, and she started to cry when she couldn't make the move. She started to grey out again.
You probably know Vistaprint for business cards, but did you know we print
look at
everything you
that.
need to get your brand in front of your fans?
A little
We
bit
print
left, I think. Yeah, a little bit left.
She started to grey out again. The sound of her name was like a lifeline reaching out to her through the gathering darkness, and blarily she caught onto it, trying to hold on.
Come on, Katie. Open your eyes.
Her eyelids, feeling raw and fleshy and so heavy, slowly lifted open, and she squinted.
Open your eyes.
The voice came from the passenger's window, where a figure kneeled, silhouetted against the sharp glitter of daylight. The brightness hurt her eyes, but Katie strained to see, clinging to the voice.
Come on, Katie.
He knows my name, she thought dreamily. She blinked, willing herself to focus. Details started to sharpen out of the blur of light, her reeling brain trying to reassemble the upside-down elements into an image. White hair, a lopsided dark suit, a smile she knew so well. No, please, no. She tried to turn away, but metal bit into bone and skin, and she nearly passed out again.
Don't you worry, Katie.
He said as she began to sob.
I will be there.
Short, but not bad. gonna be a little longer, which is fine, but this one's a 2-hour one. Lovecraft, so it's gonna be fucking racist as hell.
It's one little
I never have the time. What that means.
So me.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Yeah, let's see what we have.
The Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. Narrated by Caden Von Clegg. Original music, production, and sound design by Jesse Cornett.
I gotta get some Tums. I'll be right back. It's getting dark. Better eating habits. What's up? Hey, flower against the wall. All right, come here, you. Don't mind me, just my fat ass getting a snack. Hello! I'm making dead things. What do you think? And then, voila. But, I'm missing one. Wait a minute, where's Tall Boy? Ooh, there you go. I have one more to do. Where's your face? It's upstairs, actually. There we go. One last one to do. I don't want to do Lovecraft. Let's do something else. Boring history to sleep to. Well, that works. Well, looks like we're listening to the Dunwich Horror, H.P. Lovecraft, so...
Gorgons and hydras and chimeras, dire stories of Seleno, harpies, may reproduce themselves in the brain of superstition, but they were there before. They are transcripts, types. The archetypes are in us and eternal. How else should the recital of that which we know in a waking sense to be false come to affect us at all? Is it that we naturally conceive terror from such objects, considered in their capacity of being able to inflict upon us bodily injury? Or least of all, these terrors are of older standing. They date beyond the body, or without the body, they would have been the same. That the kind of fear here treated is purely spiritual, that it is strong in proportion as it is objectless on earth, that it predominates in the period of our sinless infancy, difficulties the solution of which might afford some probable insight into our anti-mundane condition, and a peep, at least, into the shadowland of pre-existence. Charles Lamb, Witches and Other Night Fears. Witches and Other Night Fears. 1. When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Aylesbury Pike just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. The ground gets higher, and the briar-bordered stone walls press closer and closer against the ruts of the dusty, curving road. The trees of the frequent forest belts seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses attain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the planted fields appear singularly few and barren, while the sparsely scattered houses wear a surprisingly uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask directions from the gnarled, solitary figures spied now and then on crumbling doorsteps, on the sloping, grass-grown hills. Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow confronted by forbidden things, with which it would be better to have nothing to do. When a rise in the road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness is increased. The summits are too rounded and symmetrical to give a sense of comfort and naturalness, and sometimes the sky silhouettes with especial clearness the queer circles of tall stone pillars with which most of them are crowned. Gorges and ravines of problematical depth intersect the way, and the crude wooden bridges always seem of dubious safety. When the road dips again, there are stretches of marshland that one instinctively dislikes, and indeed almost fears at evening when unseen whippoorwills chatter and the fireflies come out in abnormal profusion to dance to the raucous, creepily insistent rhythms of stridently piping bullfrogs. The thin, shining line of the Miskatonic's upper reaches has an oddly serpent-like suggestion as it winds close to the feet of the domed hills among which it rises. As the hills draw nearer, one heeds their wooded sides more than their stone-crowned tops. Those sides loom up so darkly and precipitously that one wishes they would keep their distance, but there is no road by which to escape them. Across a covered bridge, one sees a small village huddled between the stream and vertical slope of Round Mountain, and wonders at the cluster of rotting gambrel roofs bespeaking an earlier architectural period than that of the neighboring region. It is not reassuring to see on a closer glance that most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and that the broken-steepled church now harbors the one slovenly mercantile establishment of the hamlet. One dreads to trust the tenebrous tunnel of the bridge, yet there is no way to avoid it. Once across, it is hard to prevent the impression of a faint, malign odor about the village street, as of the massed mold and decay of centuries. It is always a relief to get clear of the place and to follow the narrow road around the base of the hills and across the level country beyond till it rejoins the Aylesbury Pike. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible, and since a certain season of horror, all the signboards pointing toward it have been taken down. The scenery, judged by any ordinary aesthetic canon, is more than commonly beautiful. Yet there is no influx of artists or summer tourists. 2 centuries ago, when talk of witch blood, Satan worship, and strange forest presences was not laughed at, it was the custom to give reasons for avoiding the locality. In our sensible age, since the Dunwich Horror of 1928 was hushed up by those who had the town's and the world's welfare at heart, people shun it without knowing exactly why. Perhaps one reason, though it cannot apply to uninformed strangers, is that the natives are now repellently decadent, having gone far along that path of retrogression so common in many New England backwaters. They have come to form a race by themselves, with the well-defined mental and physical stigmata of degeneracy and inbreeding.
Jesus
The average
Christ,
of their
racist
intelligence
bastard.
is woefully low, whilst their annals reek of overt viciousness and of half-hidden murders, incests, and deeds of almost unnameable violence and perversity. The
You
old
projecting
gentry,
much?
representing the 2 or 3 armigerous families which came from Salem in 1692, have kept somewhat above the general level of decay, though many branches are sunk into the sordid populace so deeply that only their names remain as a key to the origin they disgrace. Some of the Watleys and bishops still send their eldest sons to Harvard and Miskatonic, though those sons seldom return to the moldering gambrel roofs under which they and their ancestors were born. No one, even those who have the facts concerning the recent horror, can say just what is the matter with Dunwich, though old legends speak of unhallowed rites and conclaves of the Indians amidst which they called forbidden shapes of shadow out of the great rounded hills, and made wild orgiastic prayers that were answered by loud crackings and rumblings from the ground below. In 1747, the Reverend Abijah Hoadley, newly come to the Congregational Church at Dunwich Village, preached a memorable sermon on the close presence of Satan and his imps, in which he said, "It must be allowed that these blasphemies of an infernal train of demons are matters of too common knowledge to be denied. The cursed voices of Azazel and Buzrael and Beelzebub and Belial being heard now from underground by above a score of credible witnesses now living. I myself did not more than a fortnight ago catch a very plain discourse of evil powers in the hill behind my house, wherein there were a rattling and rolling, groaning, screeching, and hissing, such as no things of this earth could raise up, and which must needs have come from those caves that only black magic can discover, and only the devil unlock." Mr. Hoadley disappeared soon after delivering this sermon, but the text, printed in Springfield, is still extant. Noises in the hills continue to be reported from year to year, and still form a puzzle to geologists and physiographers. Other traditions tell of foul odors near the hill-crowning circles of stone pillars, and of rushing, airy presences to be heard faintly at certain hours from stated points at the bottom of the great ravines, while still others try to explain the Devil's Hop Yard, a bleak, blasted hillside where no tree, shrub, or grass blade will grow. Then, too, the natives are mortally afraid of the numerous whippoorwills which grow vocal on warm nights. It is vowed that the birds are sycophants lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that they time their eerie cries in unison with the sufferer's struggling breath. If they can catch the fleeing soul when it leaves the body, they instantly flutter away, chittering demoniac laughter. But if they fail, they subside gradually into a disappointed silence. These tales, of course, are obsolete and ridiculous, because they come down from very old times. Dunwich is indeed ridiculously old, older by far than any of the communities within 30 miles of it.
We do
South
like
of
these
the village,
phones.
one may still spy the cellar walls and chimney of the ancient Bishop House, which was built before 1700, whilst the ruins of the mill at the Falls, built in 1806, form the most modern piece of architecture to be seen. Industry did not flourish here, and the 19th century factory movement proved short-lived. Oldest of all are the great rings of rough-hewn stone columns on the hilltops, but these are more generally attributed to the Indians than to the settlers. Deposits of skulls and bones found within these circles and around the sizable table-like rock on Sentinel Hill sustain the popular belief that such spots were once the burial places of the Pocumtucks, even though many ethnologists, disregarding the absurd improbability of such a theory, persist in believing the remains Caucasian.
Shake and win millions of prizes with the AliExpress $1 challenge. Get unreal deals for just $1. Win $10,000 in flight credits.
Yeah, nobody cares.
Two. It was in the township of Dunwich, in a large and partly inhabited farmhouse set against a hillside 4 miles from the village and 1.5 miles from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whatley was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1913. This date was recalled because it was Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded, and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that the mother was one of the decadent Whatleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half-insane father about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Lavinia Whatley had no known husband, but according to the custom of the region made no attempt to disavow the child, concerning the other side of whose ancestry the country folk might, and did, speculate as widely as they chose. On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pink-eyed albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about its unusual powers and tremendous future. Lavinia was one who would be apt to mutter such things, for she was a lone creature given to wandering amidst thunderstorms in the hills and trying to read the great odorous books which her father had inherited through 2 centuries of Whatleys, and which were fast falling to pieces with age and wormholes. She had never been to school, but was filled with disjointed scraps of ancient lore that old Whatley had taught her. The remote farmhouse had always been feared because of old Whatley's reputation for black magic, and the unexplained death by violence of Mrs. Whatley when Lavinia was 12 years old had not helped to make the place popular. Isolated among strange influences, Lavinia was fond of wild and grandiose daydreams and singular occupations, nor was her leisure much taken up by household cares in a home from which all standards of order and cleanliness had long since disappeared.
House is a mess.
There was a hideous screaming which echoed above even hill noises and the dogs barking on the night Wilbur was born, but no known doctor or midwife presided at his coming. Neighbors knew nothing of him till a week afterward, when old Whatley drove his sleigh through the snow into Dunwich village and discoursed incoherently to the group of loungers at Osborne's general store. There seemed to be a change in the old man, an added element of furtiveness in the clouded brain which subtly transformed him from an object to a subject of fear. Though he was not to be perturbed by any common family event, amidst it all, he showed some trace of the pride later noticed in his daughter, and what he said of the child's paternity was remembered by many of his hearers years afterward.
How do I fix you in, like, how to put the glass in there? Hot glue's not gonna work on the glass.
If Lavinia's boy looked like his pa, he wouldn't look like nothing you expect. You needn't think the only folks is the folks hereabouts. Lavinia's read some, and has seed some of the things most of you'd only tell about. I calculate her man's as good a husband as you can find this side of Aylesbury. And if you knowed as much about the hills as I do, you wouldn't ask no better church wedding nor hern. Let me tell you something. Someday you folks will hear a child of Lavinia's calling his father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill.
The only persons who saw Wilbur during the first month of his life were old Zechariah Whatley of the undecayed Whatleys and Earl Sawyer's common-law wife, Mamie Bishop. Mamie's visit was frankly one of curiosity, and her subsequent tales did justice to her observations. But Zechariah came to lead a pair of Alderney cows, which old Watley had bought of his son Curtis. They marked the beginning of a course of cattle buying on the part of small Wilbur's family, which ended only in 1928, when the Dunwich Horror came and went. Yet at no time did the ramshackle Watley barn seem overcrowded with livestock. There came a period when people were curious enough to steal up and count the herd that grazed precariously on the steep hillside above the old farmhouse, and they could never find more than 10 or 12 anemic, bloodless-looking specimens, evidently some blight or distemper, perhaps sprung from the unwholesome pasturage, or the diseased fungi and timbers of the filthy barn, caused a heavy mortality amongst the Watley animals. Odd wounds or sores, having something of the aspect of incisions, seemed to afflict the visible cattle, and once or twice during the earlier months, certain callers fancied they could discern similar sores about the throats of the grey, unshaven old man and his slatternly, crinkly-haired albino daughter. Spring after Wilbur's birth, Lavinia resumed her customary rambles in the hills, bearing in her misproportioned arms the swarthy child. Public interest in the Watley subsided after most of the country folk had seen the baby, and no one bothered comment on the swift development which that newcomer seemed every day to exhibit. Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal, for within 3 months of his birth he had attained a size and muscular power not usually found in infants under a full year of age. His motions and even his vocal sounds showed a restraint and deliberateness highly peculiar in an infant.
I can't finish them because they're,
when, at 7 months, he began to walk.
They're, the domes. I need to use some, Goo Gone to get rid of the sticker that they came on, but then I'll just dome them up. So, get this one, and I get this one. These out of the way, and I can start on with the next project that's got my attention. This pink one, and this purpley blue one. The yellow one, another purpley blue one. I thought those were teeth. They don't sell too fast, so this batch should last me next year. And the broken one, and the sitting pink one. This one, and this one. And for some reason, an extra one. Alright, we'll find them at home as well. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. That's 10 sitting. Wait. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 11. No. 10 sitting with their, they just need their domes. I did 11 if I include the glass dome that I finished. So that's 11, and yesterday I did a set of 4 framed tiny ones and 4 framed large ones. So, getting there. Alright, back to...
Unassisted, with falterings, which another month was sufficient to remove. It was somewhat after this time, on Halloween, that a great blaze was seen at midnight on the top of Sentinel Hill, where the old table-like stone stands amidst its tumulus of ancient bones. Considerable talk was started when Silas Bishop, of the Undecayed Bishops, mentioned having seen the boy running sturdily up that hill ahead of his mother about an hour before the blaze was remarked. Silas was rounding up a stray heifer, but he nearly forgot his mission when he fleetingly spied the 2 figures in the dim light of his lantern. They darted almost noiselessly through the underbrush, and the astonished watcher seemed to think they were entirely unclothed. Afterward, he could not be sure about the boy, who may have had some kind of a fringed belt and a pair of dark trunks or trousers on. Wilbur was never subsequently seen alive and conscious without complete and tightly buttoned attire. the disarrangement or threatened disarrangement of which always seemed to fill him with anger and alarm. His contrast with his squalid mother and grandfather in this respect was thought very notable until the horror of 1928 suggested the most valid of reasons. The next January, gossips were mildly interested in the fact that Lavinia's black brat had commenced to talk, and at the age of only 11 months. His speech was somewhat remarkable, both because of its difference from the ordinary accents of the region, and because it displayed freedom from infantile lisping, of which many children of 3 or 4 might well be proud of. The boy was not talkative, yet when he spoke, he seemed to reflect some elusive element wholly unpossessed by Dunwich and its denizens. The strangeness did not reside in what he said, or even in the simple idioms he used, but seemed vaguely linked with his intonation, or with the internal organs that produced the spoken sounds. His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity, for though he shared his mother's and grandfather's chinlessness, his firm and precociously shaped nose united with the expression of his large, dark, almost Latin eyes to give him an air of quasi-adulthood and well-nigh preternatural intelligence. He was, however, exceedingly ugly, despite his appearance of leniency, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large, pored, yellowish skin, coarse, crinkly hair, and odd, elongated ears. He was soon disliked, even more decidedly than his mother and grandson, and all conjectures about him were spiced with references to the bygone magic of Old Wantley, and how the hills once shook when he shrieked the dreadful name of Yog-Sothoth in the midst of a circle of stones with a great book open in his arms before him. Dogs abhorred him, and he was always obliged to take various defensive measures against their barking menace.
That'll work.
Meanwhile, Old Watley continued to buy cattle without measurably increasing the size of his herd. He acquired timber and began to repair the unused part of his house, a spacious peaked roof, he said, whose rear end was buried entirely in the rocky hillside. The least ruined ground floor had always been sufficient for himself and his daughter. It must have been prodigious reserves of strength in the old man to enable him to accomplish so much hard labor, and though he still battled tormentedly at times, his carpentry seemed to show the effects of sound calculation. It had already begun as soon as Wilbur was born, when one of the many tool sheds had been put suddenly in order, clapboarded and fitted with a stout, fresh lock. Now, in restoring the abandoned upper story of the house, he was a no less thorough craftsman. His mania showed itself only in his tight boarding up of all the windows in the plainest section, though many declared that it was a crazy thing to bother with the reclamation at all. Less inexplicable was his fitting up of another downstairs room for his new grandson, a room which several callers saw, though no one was ever admitted to the closely boarded upper story. This chamber he lined with tall, firm shelving, along which he began gradually to arrange in apparently careful order all the rotting ancient books and parts of books, which during his own day had been heaped promiscuously in odd corners of the various rooms.
Okay, I can work with that.
I made some use of them, he would say as he tried to mend the torn black letter page with paste prepared on the rusty kitchen stove. But the boy is hitting a big bed of something. We don't want to have him as well started as he can. They're going to be all of his learning. When Wilbur was a year and 7 months old, in September of 1914, his size and accomplishments were almost alarming. He had grown as large as a child of 4, and was a fluent and incredibly intelligent talker. He ran freely about the fields and hills, and accompanied his mother on all her wanderings. At home he would pore diligently over the queer pictures and charts in his grandfather's books, while old Watley would instruct and catechize him through long, hushed afternoons. By this time the restoration of the house was finished, and those who watched it wondered why one of the upper windows had been made into a solid plank door. It was a window in the rear of the east gable end, close to the hill, and no one could imagine why a cleated wooden runway was built up to it from the ground. About the period of this work's completion, people noticed that the old tool house, tightly locked and windowless, clapboarded since Wilbur's birth, had been abandoned again. The door swung listlessly open, and when Earl Sawyer once stepped within, after a cattle-selling call on Old Whatley, he was quite discomposed by the singular odor he encountered, such a stench, he averred, as he had never before smelt in all his life, except near the Indian circles on the hills, and which could not come from anything sane or of this earth. But then the homes and sheds of Dunwich folk have never been remarkable for olfactory immaculateness. The following months were void of visible events, save that everyone swore to a slow but steady increase in the mysterious hill noises. On May Eve of 1915, there were tremors, which even the Aylesbury people felt, whilst the following Halloween produced an underground rumbling queerly synchronized with bursts of flame. "Them which Whatley's doin's," from the summit of Sentinel Hill. Wilbur was growing up uncannily, so that he looked like a boy of 10 as he entered his 4th year. He read avidly by himself now, but talked much less than formerly. A settled taciturnity was absorbing him, and for the first time people began to speak specifically of the dawning look of evil in his goatish face. He would sometimes mutter an unfamiliar jargon, and chant in bizarre rhythms, which chilled the listener with a sense of unexplained terror. The aversion displayed toward him by dogs had now become a matter of wide remark, and he was obliged to carry a pistol in order to traverse the countryside in safety. His occasional use of the weapon did not enhance his popularity amongst the owners of canine guardians. A few callers at the house would often find Lavinia alone on the ground floor, while odd cries and footsteps resounded in the boarded-up second story. She would never tell what her father and the boy were doing up there, though once she turned pale and displayed an abnormal degree of fear when a jocose fish peddler tried the locked door leading to the stairway. That peddler told the store loungers at Dunwich Village that he thought he heard a horse stamping on that floor above. The loungers reflected, thinking of the door and runway and of the cattle that so swiftly disappeared. Then they shuddered as they recalled tales of old Whatley's youth and of the strange things that are called out of the earth when a bullock is sacrificed at the proper time to certain heathen gods. It had for some time been noticed that dogs had begun to hate and fear the whole Whatley place as violently as they hated and feared young Wilbur personally. In 1917, the war came, and Squire Sawyer Whatley, as chairman of the local draft board, had hard work finding a quota of young Dunwich men, fit even to be sent to a development camp. The government, alarmed at some signs of wholesale regional decadence, sent several officers and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey which New England newspaper readers may still recall. It was the publicity attending this investigation which set reporters on the track of the Whatleys, and caused Boston Globe and Arkham Advertiser to print flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's precociousness, old Whatley's black magic, the shelves of strange books, the sealed second story of the ancient farmhouse, and the weirdness of the whole region and its hill noises. Wilbur was 4 and a half then, and looked like a lad of 15. His lips and cheeks were fine, with a coarse dark down, and his voice had begun to break. Earlier went out to Whatley's place with both sets of reporters and cameramen, and called their attention to the queer stench which now ceased to trickle down from the sealed upper spaces. It was, he said, exactly like a smell he had found in a tool shed abandoned when the house was finally repaired, and like the faint odors which he sometimes thought he caught near the stone circles on the mountains. Dunwich folk read the stories when they appeared and grinned over the obvious mistakes. They wondered, too, why the writers made so much of the fact that old Whatley always paid for his cattle in gold pieces of extremely ancient date. The Watleys had received their visitors with ill-concealed distaste, though they did not dare court further publicity by a violent resistance or refusal to talk. 4.
Just because we're not living doesn't mean we don't enjoy a good living room.
And Michael's Halloween decor really knocks it.
Why is Michael's decor always pink for Halloween?
4. For a decade, the annals of the Watleys sink indistinguishably into the general life of a morbid community, used to their queer ways and hardened to their May Eve and All Hallows orgies. Twice a year, they would light fires on the top of Sentinel Hill, at which times the mountain rumblings would recur with greater and greater violence, while at all seasons there were strange and portentous doings at the lonely farmhouse. In the course of time, callers professed to hear sounds in the sealed upper story, even when all the family were downstairs, and they wondered how swiftly or how lingeringly a cow or bullock was usually sacrificed. There was talk of a complaint to the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, but nothing ever came of it, since Dunwich folk are never anxious to call the outside world's attention to themselves. About 1923, when Wilbur, a boy of 10, whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave all the impression of maturity, a second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house. It was all inside the sealed upper part, and from bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out all the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the peaked roof. They had torn down the great central chimney, too, and fitted the rusty range with a flimsy outside tin stovepipe. In the spring after this, old Watley noticed the growing number of whippoorwills that would come out of Cold Spring Glen to chirp under his window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance, and told the loungers at Osborne's that he thought his time had almost come.
They whistle just in tune with my breathing now,
he said.
And I guess they're getting ready to catch my soul. They know it's a-going out, and don't calculate to miss it. You'll know, boys, arter I'm gone, whether they get me or not. If they do, they'll keep up a-singing and laugh until break of day. If they don't, they'll kinder quiet down like. I expect them and the souls they hunts for have some pretty tough tussles sometimes.
On Lammas night, 1924, Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury was hastily summoned by Wilbur Watley, who had lashed his one remaining horse through the darkness and telephoned from Osborne's in the village. He found old Watley in a very grave state, with a cardiac action and stertorous breathing that told of an end not far off. The shapeless albino daughter and oddly bearded grandson stood by the bedside, whilst from the vacant abyss overhead there came a disquieting suggestion of rhythmical surging or lapping, as the waves on some level beach.
Oh,
the doctor, though, was chiefly disturbed by the chattering night birds outside, a seemingly limitless legion of whippoorwills that cried their endless message in repetitions timed diabolically to the wheezing gasps of the dying man. It was uncanny and unnatural. Too much, thought Dr. Houghton. Like the whole of the region, he had entered so reluctantly in response to the urgent call. Toward 1 o'clock, old Watley gained consciousness and interrupted his wheezing to choke out a few words to his grandson.
More space, Willie. More space soon. You grows, and I grows faster. He'll be ready to serve you soon, boy. Open up the gates to Yogg's house with the long chant that you'll find on page 751 of the complete edition. And then put a match to the prison. Fire from ours, can't burn it nohow.
He was obviously quite mad. After a pause, during which the flock of whippoorwills outside adjusted their cries to the older tempo while some indications of the strange hill noises came from afar off, he added another sentence or two.
Feed it regular, Willie, and mind the quantity. But don't let it grow too fast for the place. For if it bursts colors or gets out before he opens to yoke himself off, it's all over no use. Only them from beyond kin make it multiply and work. Only them, the old uns, is wants to come back.
But speech gave place to gasps again, and Lavinia screamed at the way the whippoorwills followed the change. It was the same for more than an hour, when the final throaty rattle came. Dr. Houghton drew shrunken lids over the glazing gray eyes as the tumult of birds faded imperceptibly into silence. Lavinia sobbed, but Wilbur only chuckled, whilst the hill noises rumbled faintly.
They didn't get 'em,
he muttered in his heavy bass voice. Wilbur was by this time a scholar of really tremendous erudition in his one-sided way, and was quietly known by correspondence to many librarians in distant places where rare and forbidden books of old days are kept. He was more and more hated and dreaded around Dunwich because of certain youthful disappearances which suspicion laid vaguely at his door, but was always able to silence inquiry through fear or through use of that fund of old-time gold, which still, as in his grandfather's time, went forth regularly and increasingly for cattle buying. He was now tremendously mature of aspect, and his height, having reached the normal adult limit, seemed inclined to wax beyond that figure. In 1925, when a scholarly correspondent from Miskatonic University called upon him one day, and departed pale and puzzled, he was fully
1925 was not that long
6
ago.
feet tall. Through all the years, Wilbur had treated his half-deformed albino mother with a growing contempt, finally forbidding her to go to the hills with him on May Eve and Hallowmass. And in 1926, the poor creature complained to Mamie Bishop of being afraid of him.
There's more about him as I knows than I can tell, maybe.
She said.
And nowadays, there's more what I know myself. I vow for God, I don't know what he wants, nor what he's a-trying to do.
That Halloween, the hill noises sounded louder than ever, and fire burned on Sentinel Hill as usual, but people paid more attention to the rhythmical screaming of vast flocks of unnaturally belated whippoorwills, which seemed to be assembled near the unlighted Watley farmhouse. After midnight, their shrill notes burst into a kind of pandemoniac cachinnation, which filled all the countryside, and not until dawn did they finally quiet down. Then they vanished, hurrying southward where they were fully a month overdue. What this meant, no one could quite be certain till later. None of the country folks seemed to have died, but poor Lavinia Watley, the twisted albino, was never seen again. In the summer of 1927, he repaired 2 sheds in the farmyard and began moving his books and effects out to them. Soon afterward, Earl Sawyer told the loungers at Osborne's that more carpentry was going on in the Watley farmhouse. Wilbur was closing all the doors and windows on the ground floor and seemed to be taking out partitions as he and his grandfather had done upstairs 4 years before. He was living in one of the sheds, and Sawyer thought he seemed unusually worried and tremulous. People generally suspected him of knowing something about his mother's disappearance, and very few ever approached his neighborhood now. His height had increased to more than 7 feet, and showed no signs of ceasing its development. The following winter brought an event no less strange than Wilbur's first trip outside the Dunwich region. Correspondence with the Widener Library at Harvard, the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris, and the British Museum, the University of Buenos Aires, and the Library of Miskatonic University of Arkham, had failed to get him the loan of a book he desperately wanted. So at length he set out in person, shabby, dirty, bearded, and uncouth of dialect, to consult the copy at Miskatonic, which was the nearest to him geographically. Almost 8 feet tall and carrying a cheap new valise from Osborne's general store, this dark and goatish gargoyle appeared one day in Arkham in quest of the dreaded volume, kept under lock and key at the college library, the hideous Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in Olaus Wormius Latin version, as printed in Spain in the 17th century. He had never seen a city before, but had no thought save to find his way to the university grounds, where indeed he passed heedlessly by the great white-fanged watchdog that barked with unnatural fury and enmity, and tugged frantically at its stout chain. Wilbur had with him the priceless but imperfect copy of Dr. Dee's English version, which his grandfather had bequeathed him, and upon receiving access to the Latin copy, he at once began to collate the two texts with the aim of discovering a certain passage, which would have come on the 751st page of his own defective volume. This much he could not civilly refrain from telling the librarian, the same erudite Henry Armitage, A.M., Miskatonic, Ph.D. Princeton, Literature, D. Johns Hopkins, who had once called at the farm, and who now politely plied him with questions. He was looking, he had to admit, for a kind of formula or incantation containing the frightful name Yog-Sothoth, and it puzzled him to find discrepancies, duplications, and ambiguities, which made the matter of determination far from easy. As he copied the formula he finally chose, Dr. Armitage looked involuntarily over his shoulder at the open pages, the left-hand one of which, in the Latin version, contained such monstrous threats to the peace and sanity of the world. Nor is it to be thought, ran the text as Armitage translated it, that man is either the oldest or the last of Earth's masters, or that the common bulk of life and substance walks alone.
Better late than
the
never.
old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be. Not in a space of freedom,
No, that
but
texture.
between them. They walk serene and primal, undimensioned, and to us unseen. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate, past, present,
I'm gonna pretend that was from the recording, and not something growling outside my house.
future. All are one in Yog-Sothoth. He knows where the old ones broke through of old, and where they shall break through again. He knows where they have trod earth's fields, and where they still tread, and why no one can behold them as they tread. By their smell can men sometimes know them near, but of their semblance can no man know, saving only in the features of those they have begotten on mankind. And of those are there many sorts, differing in likeness from man's truest eidolon, to that shape without sight or substance which is them. They walk unseen and foul in lonely places, where the words have been spoken and the rites howled through at their seasons. The wind gibbers with their voices, and the earth mutters with their consciousness. They bend the forest and crush the city, yet may not forest or city behold the hand that smites. Kadath in the cold waste hath known them, and what man knows Kadath? The ice desert of the south, and the sunken isles of ocean hold stones whereon their seal is engraven. But who hath seen the deep frozen city, or the sealed tower long garlanded with seaweed and barnacles? Great Cthulhu is their cousin, yet can he spy them only dimly. La Shobnigurath, as a foulness shall ye know them. Their hand is at your throats, yet ye see them not, and their habitation is even one with their guarded threshold. Yog-Sothoth is the key to the gate, whereby the spheres meet. Man rules now where they ruled once. They shall soon rule where man rules now. After summer is winter, and after winter summer. They wait patient and potent, for here shall they reign again.
Shit.
Dr. Armitage associated what he was reading with what he had heard of Dunwich and its brooding presences, and of Wilbur Whatley and his dim, hideous aura that stretched from a dubious birth to a cloud of probable matricide, felt a wave of fright as tangible as a drought of the tomb's cold calamities. The bent, goated giant before him seemed like the spawn of another planet or dimension, like something only partly of mankind, and linked to black gulfs of essence and entity that stretch like titan phantasms beyond all spheres of force and matter, space and time. Presently Wilbur raised his head and began speaking in that strange, resonant fashion which hinted at sound-producing organs unlike the run of mankind.
Oh, that didn't go through the plastic.
Mr. Armitage, he said, I calculate I've got to take that book home. There's things in it I've got to try under certain conditions that I can't get here. And it'd be a mortal sin to let a red tape rule hold me up. Let me take it along, sir, and I'll swear there won't nobody know the difference. I don't need to tell you, I'll take good care of it. They want me to put this D copy in the shape it is. He stopped as he saw firm denial on the librarian's face, and his own goatish features grew crafty. Armitage, half ready to tell him he might make a copy of what parts he needed, thought suddenly of the possible consequences and checked himself. There was too much responsibility in giving such a being the key to such blasphemous outer spheres. Whatley saw how things stood and tried to answer lightly. Well, all right, if you feel that way about it. Maybe Harvard won't be so fussy as you be. And without saying more, he rose and strode out of the building, stooping at each doorway. Armitage heard the sounds he had heard and recalled the old Sunday stories in the Advertiser, these things and the lore he had picked up from Dunwich rustics and villagers during his one visit there. Unseen things not of Earth, or at least not of tri-dimensional Earth, rushed fetid and horrible through New England's glens, part of the intruding horror, and to glimpse a hellish advance in the black dominion of the ancient and once passive nightmare. He locked away the Necronomicon with a shudder of disgust, but the room still reeked with an unholy and unidentifiable stench. As a foulness shall ye know them, he quoted. Yes, the odor was the same as that which had sickened him at the Whatley farmhouse less than 3 years before. He thought of Wilbur, goatish and ominous once again, and laughed mockingly at the village rumors of his parentage. Inbreeding? Armitage muttered half aloud to himself. Great God, what symptoms! Show them Arthur Macken's Great God pan, and they'll think it a common Dunwich scandal. But what thing, what cursed shapeless influence on or off this three-dimension earth was Wilbur Whatley's father, born on Candlemas, 9 months after May Eve of 1912, when the talk about the queer old and half-human flesh and blood. During the ensuing weeks, Dr. Armitage set about to collect all possible data on Wilbur Whatley and the formless presences around Dunwich. He got in communication with Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury, who had attended old Whatley in his last illness, and found much to ponder over in the grandfather's last words as quoted by the physician. A visit to Dunwich village failed to bring out much that was new, but a close survey of the Necronomicon, in those parts which Wilbur had sought so avidly, seemed to supply new and terrible clues to the nature, methods, and desires of the strange evil so vaguely threatening this planet. Talks with several students to Arcadia in Boston, and letters to many others elsewhere, gave him a growing amazement which passed slowly through varied degrees of alarm to a state of really acute spiritual fear. As the summer drew on, he felt dimly that something had to be done about the lurking terrors of the upper Miskatonic Valley, and about the monstrous being known to the human world as Wilbur Whatley.
Excel. Do what feels fresh.
shouldn't have painted it, but I did. Pardon me.
6. The Dunwich Horror itself came between Lammas and 1928, and Dr. Arnold among those who witnessed its monstrous prologue. He had heard, meanwhile, of Whatley's grotesque trip to Cambridge, and of his frantic efforts to borrow or copy from the Necronomicon at the Widener Library. Those efforts had been in vain, since Armitage had issued warnings of the keenest intensity to all librarians having charge of the dreaded volume. Wilbur had been shockingly nervous at Cambridge, anxious for the book, yet almost equally anxious to get home again, as if he feared the results of being away long. Early in August, the half-expected outcome developed, and in the small hours of the 3rd, Dr. Armitage was awakened, suddenly, by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdog on the college campus. Deep and terrible, the snarling, half-mad growls and barks continued, always in mounting volume, but with hideously significant pauses. Then there rang out a scream from a wholly different throat. Such a scream as roused half the sleepers of Arkham, and haunted their dreams ever afterward. Such a scream as could come from no being born of earth, or wholly of earth. Armitage, hastening some clothing and rushing across the street and lawn to the college buildings, saw that others were ahead of him, and heard the echoes of a burglar alarm still shrilling from the library. An open window showed black and gaping in the moonlight. What had come had indeed completed its entrance. The barking and the screaming now fast fading into a mixed low growling and moaning, proceeded unmistakably from within. Some instinct warned Armitage that what was taking place was nothing for unfortified eyes to see, so he brushed back the crowd with authority as he unlocked the vestibule door.
For whose eyes?
Among the others, he saw Professor Warren Rice and Dr. Francis Morgan, men to whom he had told some of his conjectures and misgivings, and these two he motioned to accompany him inside. The inward sounds, except for a watchful, droning whine from the dog, had by this time quite subsided, but Armitage now perceived with a sudden start that a loud chorus of whippoorwills among the shrubbery had commenced, a damnably rhythmical piping, as if in unison with the last breaths of a dying man. The building was full of a frightful stench which Dr. Armitage knew too well, and the three men rushed across the hall to the small genealogical reading room whence the low whining came. For a second nobody dared to turn on the light. Then Armitage summoned up his courage and snapped the switch. One of the three, it is not certain which, shrieked aloud at what sprawled before them among disordered tables and overturned chairs. Professor Rice declares that he wholly lost consciousness for an instant, though he did not stumble or fall. The thing that lay half-bent on its side in a fetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall, and the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. It was not quite dead, but twitched silently and spasmodically while its chest heaved in monstrous unison with the mad piping of the expectant whippoorwills outside. Bits of shoe leather and fragments of apparel were scattered about the room, and just inside the window, an empty canvas sack lay where it had evidently been thrown. Near the central desk, a revolver had fallen, a dented but undischarged cartridge, later explaining why it had not been fired. The thing itself, however, crowded out all other images at the time. It would be trite and not wholly accurate to say that no human pen could describe it, but one may properly say that it could not be vividly visualized by anyone whose ideas of aspect and contour are too closely bound up with the common life forms of this planet and of the 3 known dimensions. It was partly human, with very manlike head, and the goatish, chinless face had the Whatleys upon it, but the torso and lower parts of the body were teratologically fabulous, so that only generous clothing could ever have enabled it to walk on Earth unchallenged or uneradicated. Above the waist it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest, where the dog's rending paws still rested watchfully, had the leathery reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald, with yellow and black, and dimly suggested the squamous cover of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, for here all human resemblance left off and sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red sucking mouths protruded limply. Their arrangement was odd, and seemed to follow the symmetries of some cosmic geometry unknown to Earth or the solar system. On each of the hips, deep set in a kind of pinkish, ciliated orbit, was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye, while in lieu of a tail there depended a kind of trunk or feeler, with purple annular markings, and with many evidences of being an undeveloped mouth or throat. The limbs, save for their black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of prehistoric Earth's giant saurians, and terminated in ridgy veined pads that were neither hooves nor claws. When the thing breathed, its tail and tentacles rhythmically changed color, as if from some circulatory cause normal to the non-human side of its ancestry. In the tentacles, this was observable as a deepening of the greenish tinge, whilst in the tail it was manifest as a yellowish appearance which alternated with sickly grayish white in the spaces between the purple rings. Of genuine blood there was none, only the fetid greenish-yellow ichor which trickled along the painted floor beyond the radius of the stickiness, and left a curious discoloration behind it. As the presence of the three men seemed to rouse the dying thing, it began to mumble without turning or raising its head. Dr. Armitage made no written record of its mouthings, but asserts confidently that nothing in English was uttered. At first the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of Earth, but toward the last there came some disjointed fragments evidently taken from the Necronomicon, that monstrous blasphemy in quest of which the thing had perished. These fragments, as Armitage recalls them, ran something like Gai Ngaga Bug Shugog Ya Yog Sothoth Yog Sothoth. They trailed off into nothingness as the whippoorwills shrieked in rhythmical crescendos of unholy anticipation. Then came a halt in the gasping, and the dog raised its head in a long, lugubrious howl. A change came over the yellow, goatish face of the prostrate thing, and the great black eyes fell in appallingly. Outside the window, the shrilling of the whippoorwills had suddenly ceased, and above the murmurs of the gathering crowd, there came the sound of a panic-struck whirring and fluttering. Against the moon, vast clouds of feathery watchers rose and raced from sight,
I'm not going to brain mood today, I guess.
For prey. All at once, the dog started up abruptly, gave a frightened bark, and leapt nervously out of the window by which it had entered. A cry rose from the crowd, and Dr. Armitage shouted to the men outside that no one must be admitted till the police or medical examiner came. He was thankful that the windows were just too high to permit of peering in, and drew the dark curtains carefully down over each one. By this time 2 policemen had arrived, and Dr. Morgan, meeting them in the vestibule, was urging them for their own sakes to postpone entrance to the stench-filled reading room till the examiner came and the prostrate thing could be covered up. Meanwhile, frightful changes were taking place on the floor. One need not describe the kind of rate of shrinkage and disintegration that occurred before the eyes of Dr. Armitage and Professor Rice, but it is permissible to say that, aside from the external appearance of face and hands, the really human element in Wilbur Whatley must have been very small. When the medical examiner came, there was only a sticky whitish mass on the painted boards, and the monstrous odor had nearly disappeared. Apparently, Whatley had had no skull or bony skeleton, at least in any true or stable sense. He had taken somewhat after his unknown father.
Score 90% off at Tamu. Download the app now.
Looking for dinner ideas? Sorry, we only do dessert.
Seven. Yet all this was only the prologue of the actual Dunwich Horror.
Jesus.
Formalities were gone through by bewildered officials, abnormal details were duly kept from press and public, and men were sent to Dunwich and Aylesbury to look up properly and notify any who might be heirs of the late Wilbur Watley. They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of the growing rumblings beneath the domed hills, and because of the unwanted stench and the surging, lapping sounds which came increasingly from the great empty shell formed by Watley's boarded-up farmhouse. Earl Sawyer, who tended the horse and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woefully acute case of nerves. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome boarded place, and were glad to confine their survey of the deceased's living quarters, the newly mended sheds, to a single visit. They filed a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aylesbury, and litigations concerning heirship are said to be still in progress amongst the innumerable Wadleys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Miskatonic Valley. An almost interminable manuscript in strange characters, written in a huge ledger and adjudged a sort of diary because of the spacing and the variations in ink and penmanship, presented a baffling puzzle to those who found it on the old bureau, which served as its owner's desk. After a week of debate, it was sent to Miskatonic University, together with the deceased collections of strange books for study and possible translation. But even the best linguists soon saw that it was not likely to be unriddled with ease. No trace of the ancient gold with which Wilbur and old Watley always paid their debts has yet been discovered. It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had been very pronounced during the evening, and dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's between Cold Spring Glen and Dunwich, rushed frenziedly back from his morning trip to 10-Acre Meadow with the cows. He was almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen, and in the yard outside, the no less frightened herd were pawing and lowing pitifully, having followed the boy back in the panic they shared with him. Between gasps, Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Mrs. Corey.
Up there in the road, beyond the glen, Miss Corey. There's something been there. It smells like thunder, and all the bushes and little trees is pushed back from the road like they'd a house been moved along of it. And that ain't the worst neither. These prints in the road, Miss Corey. Great round prints, as big as barrel heads, all sunk down deep like an elephant had been along. Only these a sight more than 4 feet can make. I looked at one or two afore I run, and I see everyone was covered with lines spreading out from one place, like as if big palm leaf fans, twice or 3 times as big as any they is, had been pounded down into the rut, and the smell was awful, like what it is around Wizard Watley's old house.
Here he faltered, seemed to shiver afresh with the fright that had sent him flying home. Mrs. Corey, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors, thus starting on its rounds the overture of panic that heralded the major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer, housekeeper at Seth Bishop's, the nearest place to Watley's, it became her turn to listen instead of transmit. For Sally's boy, Chauncey, who slept poorly, had been up on the hill toward Watley's and had dashed back in terror after one look at the place and at the pasturage where Mr. Bishop's cows had been left out all night.
Yes, Miss Corey?
Came Sally's tremulous voice over the party wire.
Chancey, he's just come back from Boston and couldn't have talked for being scared. He says old Watley's house is all blowed up, with the timber scattered around like they've been dynamite inside. Only the bottom floor ain't through, but it's all covered with kind of tar-like stuff. It smells awful and drips down off in the edges onto the ground. where the side timbers is blown away. And these awful marks in the yard, too. Great round marks, bigger round than a hawk's head, and all sticky with stuff like it's on the blowed-up house. Chancey says they lead awful messy. Where a great swath widen the barn's been matted down, and all the stun walls tumble every which way, wherever it goes. And he says he and his car is how he sought to look for Seth's cows. Tried it as he was, and found them in the upper pasture, nigh the devil's hop yard, in an awful shape. Half of them's clean gone, and nigh half of them that's left is stuck most dry blood, with sores on like that been on Watley's cattle ever since Lavinia's black brat was born. So he's gone out now to look at him. So all about he won't care to get very near Wizard Watley's. Chance didn't look careful to see where the big mouth down swath led arter had left the pasturage. But he says it thinks it pinned toward the Glen Road to the village. I tell you, Miss Carr, there's something abroad. It hadn't ought to be abroad. And I for one think that Black Wilbur Watley has come to the bad end he deserved. Is at the bottom of the breeding of it. He wasn't all human himself. I always said to everybody, and I think he and old Watley must have raised something in that there nailed up house as ain't even so human as he was. There's always been unseen things around Dunwich, living things that ain't human and ain't good for human folks. The ground was a-talking last night. Towards morning, Chancey he heard whippoorwills so loud on Cold Spring Glen he couldn't sleep none. Then he thought he heard another faint-like sound over towards Wizard Watley's pattern, ripping or tearing the wood, or some big box or crate being open far off. Oh, this man, he didn't get to sleep at all to sun up. And no sooner was he up this morning, he's got to go over to Watley's and see what's the matter. He see enough, I tell you, Miss Corey. This don't mean no good, and I think all men folks ought to get up a party and do something. I feel something awful about. Feel my time is nigh, but only God knows just what it is. Did your Lucy take the town where them big tracks led to? No? Well, Miss Corey, if they was on the Glen Road, this side of the Glen, they ain't got to your house yet. I calculate they must go into the Glen itself. They do that. I always says Cold Spring Glen ain't no healthy nor decent place. Whippoorwills and fireflies there never did act like they's creatures of God. And they them that says you can hear strange things a-rushing and a-talking in the air down there if you stand in the right place between the rock falls and bears den.
By that noon, fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between the new-made Watley ruins and Cold Spring Glen, examining in horror the vast, monstrous prints, the maimed bishop cattle, the strange, noisome wreck of the farmhouse, and the bruised, matted vegetation of the fields and roadsides. Whatever had burst loose upon the world had assuredly gone down into the great sinister ravine, for all the trees on the banks were bent and broken, and a great avenue had been gouged in the precipice-hanging underbrush. It was as though a house, launched by an avalanche, had slid down through the tangled growths of the almost vertical slope. From below no sound came, but only a distant, undefinable fetor, and it is not to be wondered at that the men preferred to stay on the edge and argue, rather than descend and beard the unknown cyclopean horror in its lair. 3 dogs that were with the party had barked furiously at first, but seemed cowed and reluctant when near the glen. Someone telephoned the news to the Aylesbury Transcript, but the editor, accustomed to wild tales from Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterward reproduced by the Associated Press. That night everyone went home, and every house and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. Needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in open pasturage. About 2 in the morning, a frightful stench and the savage barking of the dogs awakened the household at Elmer Fry's, on the eastern edge of Cold Spring Glen, and all agreed that they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping sound somewhere outside. Mrs. Fry proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree when the noise of splintering wood burst in upon their deliberations. It came apparently from the barn and was quickly followed by a hideous screaming and stamping amongst the cattle. The dogs slavered and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbed family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but knew it would be death to go out into that black farmyard. The children and the womenfolk whimpered, kept from screaming by some obscure, vestigial instinct of defense, told them their lives depended on silence. At last, the noise of the cattle subsided to a pitiful moaning. A great snapping, crashing, and crackling ensued. The Frys, huddled together in the sitting room, did not dare to move until the last echoes died away far down in Cold Spring Glen. Then, amidst the dismal moans from the stable and the demoniac piping of late whippoorwills in the glen, Selina Fry tottered to the telephone and spread what news she could of the second phase of the horror. The next day, all the countryside was in a panic, and cowed, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. Two titan swaths of destruction stretched from the glen to the Fry farmyard. Monstrous prints covered the bare patches of ground, and one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only a quarter could be found and identified. These were in curious fragments, and all that survived had to be shot. Earl Sawyer suggested that help be asked from Aylesbury or Markham, but others maintained it would be of no use. Old Zebulon Whatley, of a branch that hovered about halfway between soundness and decadence, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where tradition ran strong, and his memories of chantings in the great stone circles were not altogether connected with Wilbur and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken countryside too passive to organize for real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch in the gloom under one roof, but in general there was only a repetition of the barricading of the night before, and a futile, ineffective gesture of loading muskets and setting pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noises, and when the day came, there were many who hoped that the new horror had gone as swiftly as it had come. There were even bold souls who proposed an offensive expedition down in the glen, though they did not venture to set an actual example to the still reluctant majority. When night came again, the barricading was repeated, though there was less huddling together of families. In the morning, both the Fry and the Seth Bishop households reported excitement among the dogs and vague sounds and stenches from afar, while early explorers noted with horror a fresh set of monstrous tracks in the road skirting Sentinel Hill. As before, the sides of the road showed a bruising, indicative of the blasphemously stupendous bulk of the horror, whilst the conformation of the tracks seemed to argue a passage in two directions, as if the moving mountain had come from Cold Spring Glen and returned to it along the same path. At the base of the hill, a 30-foot swath of crushed shrubbery saplings led steeply upward, and the seekers gasped when they saw that even the most perpendicular places did not deflect the inexorable trail. Whatever the horror was, it could scale a sheer stony cliff of almost complete verticality, and as the investigators climbed around to the hill's summit by safer routes, they saw that the trail ended, or rather reversed, there. It was here that the Whatleys used to build their hellish fires and chant their hellish rituals by the table-like stone on May Eve and Hallowmass. Now that very stone formed the center of a vast space thrashed around by the mountainous horror, whilst upon its slightly concave surface was a thick and fetid deposit of the same tarry stickiness observed on the floor of the ruined Whatley farmhouse when the horror escaped. Men looked at one another and muttered. Then they looked down the hill. Apparently, the horror had descended by a route much the same as that of its ascent. To speculate was futile. Reason, logic, and normal ideas of motivation stood confounded. Only old Zebulon, who was not with the group, could have done justice to the situation or suggested a plausible explanation. Thursday night began much like the others, but it ended less happily. The whippoorwills in the glen had screamed with such unusual persistence that many could not sleep, and about 3 a.m., all the party telephones rang tremulously. Those who took down their receivers heard a fright-mad voice shriek out,
"Help! Hold on, Donald!
And some thought a crashing sound followed the breaking off of the exclamation. There was nothing more. No one dared do
I need a
anything,
phone
and no
ball.
one
That's
knew
my
till
problem.
morning whence the call came.
I don't
Then
have
those
one.
who had heard it called everyone on the line, and found that only the Frys did not reply. The truth appeared an hour later, when a hastily assembled group of armed men trudged out to the Fry place, at the head of the glen. It was horrible, yet utterly surprised. There were more swaths and monstrous prints, but there was no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amongst the ruins, nothing living or dead could be discovered. Only a stench and a tarry stickiness. The Elmer Frys had been erased from Dunwich. 8. In the meantime, a quieter, yet even more spiritually poignant phase of the horror had been blackly unwinding itself behind the closed door of a shelf-lined room in Arkham. The curious manuscript record or diary of Wilbur Whatley, delivered to Miskatonic University for translation, had caused much worry and bafflement among the experts in languages both ancient and modern. Its very alphabet, notwithstanding a general resemblance to the heavily shaded Arabic used in Mesopotamia, being absolutely unknown to any available authority. The final conclusion of the linguists was that the text represented an artificial alphabet, giving the effect of a cipher, though none of the usual methods of cryptographic solution seemed to furnish any clue, even when applied on the basis of every tongue the writer might conceivably have used. The ancient books taken from Whatley's quarters, while absorbingly interesting, and in several cases promising to open up new and terrible lines of research among philosophers and men of science, were of no assistance whatever in this matter. One of them, a heavy tome with an iron clasp, was in another unknown alphabet, this one of very different cast, and resembling Sanskrit more than anything else. The old ledger was at length given wholly into the charge of Dr. Armitage, both because of his peculiar interest in the Whatley matter, and because of his wide linguistic learning and skill in the mystical formulae of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Armitage had an idea that the alphabet might be something esoterically used by certain forbidden cults, which have come down from old times, and which have inherited many forms and traditions from the wizards of the Saracenic world. That question, however, he did not deem vital, since it would be unnecessary to know the origin of the symbols if, as he suspected, they were used as a cipher in a modern language. It was his belief that, considering the great amount of text involved, the writer would scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save perhaps in certain special formulae and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the preliminary assumption that the bulk of it was in English. Dr. Armitage knew, from the repeated failures of his colleagues, that the riddle was a deep and complex one, and that no simple mode of solution could merit even a trial. All through late August, he fortified himself with the massed lore of cryptography, drawing upon the fullest resources of his own library, and waiting night after night amidst the arcana of Trithemius' Polygraphia, Giambattista Porta's De Furtivus Literarum Notis, De Vigeneres Traite de Chiffre, Falconer's Cryptomenesis Patefacta, Davies and Thicknesses, 18th century treatises, and such fairly modern authorities as Blair, von Martin, and Kluber's Cryptographie. He interspersed his study of the books with attacks on the manuscript itself, and in time became convinced that he had to deal with one of those subtlest and most ingenious of cryptograms, in which many separate lists of corresponding letters are arranged like the multiplication table, and the message built up with arbitrary key words known only to the initiated. The older authorities seemed rather more helpful than the newer ones, and Armitage concluded that the code of the manuscript was one of great antiquity, no doubt handed down through a long line of mystical experiments. Several times he seemed near daylight, only to be set back by some unforeseen obstacle.
I think.
Then, as September approached, the clouds began to clear, Certain letters, as used in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged definitely and unmistakably, and it became obvious that the text was indeed in English. On the evening of September 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read, for the first time, a continuous passage of Wilbur Whatley's annals. It was in truth a diary, as all had thought, and it was couched in a style clearly showing the mixed occult erudition and general illiteracy of the strange being who wrote it. Almost the first long passage that Armitage deciphered, an entry dated November 26, 1916, proved highly startling and disquieting. It was written, he remembered, by a child of 3 1/2 who looked like a lad of 12 or 13. Today, learned the Aklo for the Sabaoth. It ran, which did not like, it being answerable from the hill and not from the air, that upstairs more ahead of me than I had thought it when would be, and is not like to have much earth brain. Shot Elam Hutchins, Collie Jack, when he went to bite me, and Elam says he would kill me if he das't. I guess he won't. Grandfather kept me saying the Dole formula last night, and I think I saw the inner city at the 2 magnetic poles. I shall go to those poles when the earth is cleared off, if I can't break through with the Dole formula when I commit it. They from the air told me at Sabbat that it would be years before I can clear off the earth, and I guess grandfather will be dead then, so I shall have to learn all the angles of the planes, and all the formulas between the yir and the nhr. They from outside will help, but they cannot take body without human blood. That upstairs looks it will have the right cast. I can see it a little when I make the Vurish sign, or blow the powder of Ibn Ghazi at it. And it is near like them at May Eve on the hill. The other face may wear off some. I wonder how I shall look when the earth is cleared, and there are no earth beings on it. He that came with the Aklo Sabaoth said I may be transfigured, there being much of outside to work on. Morning found Dr. Armitage in a cold sweat of terror and a frenzy of wakeful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at his table under the electric light, turning page after page with shaking hands as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text. He had nervously telephoned his wife he would not be home, and when she brought him a breakfast from the house, he could scarcely dispose of a mouthful. All that day he read on, now and then halted, maddeningly,
It won't be perfect,
as a reapplication of the
that's
complex
okay.
key became necessary. Lunch and dinner were brought him, but he ate only the smallest fraction of either. Toward the middle of the next night he drowsed off in his chair, but soon woke out of a tangle of nightmares almost as hideous as the truths and menaces to man's existence that he had uncovered. On the morning of September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while, and departed trembling and ashen gray. That evening he went to bed, but slept only fitfully. Wednesday, the next day, he was back at the manuscript and began to take copious notes both from the current sections and from those he had already deciphered. In the small hours of that night he slept a little in an easy chair in his office, but was at the manuscript again before dawn. Some time before noon his physician, Dr. Hartwell, called to see him and insisted that he cease work. He refused, intimating that it was of the most vital importance for him to complete the reading of the diary, and promising an explanation in due course of time. That evening, just as twilight fell, he finished his terrible perusal and sank back, exhausted. His wife, bringing his dinner, found him in a half-comatose state, but he was conscious enough to warn her off with a sharp cry when he saw her eyes wander toward the notes he had taken. Weakly rising, he gathered up the scribbled papers and sealed them all in a great envelope, which he immediately placed in his inside coat pocket. He had sufficient strength to get home, but was so clearly in need of medical aid that Dr. Hartwell was summoned at once. As the doctor put him to bed, he could only mutter over and over again, "But what in God's name can we do?" Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day, He made no explanations to Hartwell, but in his calmer moments spoke of the imperative need of a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startling indeed, including frantic appeals that something in a boarded-up farmhouse be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for the extirpation of the entire human race and all animal and vegetable life from the earth by some terrible elder race of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger, since the elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the system and cosmos of matter into some other plane or phase of entity from which it had once fallen, vigintillions of eons ago. At other times, he would call for the dreaded Necronomicon and the Daemonolatreia of Remigius, in which he seemed hopeful of finding some formula to check the peril he conjured up.
Stop them! Stop them!
He would shout. The Swadleys meant to let them in, and the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It's a blind business, but I know how to make the powder. It hasn't been fed since the 2nd of August, when Wilbur came here to his death. And at that rate... But Armitage had a sound physique despite his 73 years, and slept off his disorder that night without developing any real fever. He woke late Friday, clear of head, though sober, with a gnawing fear and tremendous sense of responsibility. Saturday afternoon, he felt able to go over to the library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference, and the rest of that day and evening, the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and the most desperate debate. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from the stacked shelves and from secure places of storage, and diagrams and formulae were copied with feverish haste and in bewildering abundance. Of skepticism there was none. All three had seen the body of Wilbur Whatley as it lay on the floor in a room of that very building, and after that not one of them could feel even slightly inclined to treat the diary as a madman's raving. Opinions were divided as to notifying the Massachusetts State Police, and the negative finally won. There were things involved which simply could not be believed by those who had not seen a sample, as indeed was made clear during certain subsequent investigations. Late at night, the conference disbanded, without having developed a definite plan. But all day Sunday, Armitage was busy comparing formulae and mixing chemicals obtained from the college laboratory. The more he reflected on the hellish diary, the more he was inclined to doubt the efficacy of any material agent in stamping out the entity which Wilbur Whatley had left behind him. The earth-threatening entity which, unknown to him, was to burst forth in a few hours and become the memorable Dunwich